You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
So for the past 7 or 8 years, I've been Chief Economist at PwC West Africa. I really focus on the Nigerian economy and looking at some of the issues. The thing that really keeps me in Nigeria is the sense of watching history unfold. People kept saying Nigeria is a poor country. I mean, that's absolutely false. And Nigeria is an incredibly rich country. It has an enormous number of assets, human assets, physical assets, agricultural assets. I got tired of hearing that Nigeria's biggest export is oil, because Nigeria's biggest export is people, it's Nigerian brains. People ask me why I'm optimistic, because every day I see Nigerians do extraordinary things under difficult circumstances.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Andrew Nevin, who has vast experience as an entrepreneur, investor, economist, and strategy consultant, and is currently a financial services leader and chief economist at PwC West Africa. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew. How are you?
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you, Terser. Doing very well today.
Fantastic. How's life in Abuja?
You know, we lived in Lagos for a long time. I came to Lagos the first time in 2008 and always thought I was a Lagosian. Loved it. And then we left. We had to evacuate during COVID, so we were out of the country for 15 months. And then we made the decision the last few years I would be in Nigeria. We'd spent in Abuja. We've had a great time here, different sorts of clients, different kind of lifestyle. And of course, my wife and I are not getting any younger, so it's just that the quieter pace maybe suits us at this stage. So we really enjoyed Lagos, and now we're really enjoying Abuja. And the weather is fantastic in Abuja. We like both the dry season and the rainy season, and so we're having a very good time here.
Brilliant. I bet you're not missing the Lagos traffic.
No, I mean, I lived for it with a decade, as I said, and I was always thought of that buzz and that energy. And I was pretty lucky, I lived, on Victoria Island, and my clients, who said my financial services is my industry at PwC. So my clients were banks and investment banks, so they were also quite central. So relatively, I had it quite easy traffic-wise, but still relatively easy. It's not easy.
No, it's not. So yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. So I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast, but I usually like to start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Andrew Nevin.
Yeah, so my name is Andrew. I did my graduate work in economics, but was never an economist until recently. I started work in private sector in 1987. I've had a really interesting career. I've managed to live for about the 35 years I've worked at equal amounts of time in Europe, North America, Asia, where I lived in China, and now in Africa. They've all been incredible experiences. I came to Nigeria for the first time in 2008 to do some work here. I was based at the time in the United Kingdom. Really loved doing the work here, loved the people here. I was really well supported by the managing partner at PwC. So I wanted to move here. It took a little bit of time, but I moved here full-time in 2012. So I've been here full-time for more than a decade. And my work at PwC kind of focuses on a couple of things. One, as I said, are the financial services clients, so the banks, investment banks, the stock exchange, the SEC, et cetera. But my other work was I was, in a sense, forced because of some of the challenges that we face here to become an economist again. So for the past 7 or 8 years, I've been chief economist at PwC West Africa. I really focus on the Nigerian economy and looking at some of the issues. So it's all very interesting. But I also spend a lot of my time with young Nigerians that really inspire me. So there's a number of organizations that I volunteer my time for. So, for example, the public policy school started by Madame Obi, the School for Politics, and Public Governance. I'm a faculty member there. I'm a trustee on His Royal Highness Muhammadu Sanusi II's Educational Millennial Challenge, SDG Challenge in Education. I'm in the advisory board of Imoukhuede's NGO, which focuses on governance and healthcare. So I really get a chance to see a lot of different parts of Nigeria and interact with a lot of amazing Nigerian young people. I also really like the tech scene here.
Yes.
And follow a lot of companies and have invested as an angel investor in a few, though that's coming to an end as I retire. But I really enjoyed those interactions. So I've had an amazing time in Nigeria, kind of all sorts of different experiences. Really have enjoyed it here.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Andrew. So you've given us a nice overview in terms of your transition into the work of being an economist, working in Europe, Asia, Africa, and now in Nigeria for 10 years and covering private and public sector work initiatives that you're involved in. As you mentioned, you're currently the Chief Economist at PwC West Africa. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that in terms of your role. What does it involve? And for people who are listening who don't quite understand the work of PwC as well, just a bit more about what the company does.
Right. So PwC, which used to be known as PricewaterhouseCoopers, is the largest professional services firm in the world. So there's people might have heard the term the Big Four.
Yes.
So you have PwC, E&Y, Deloitte, and KPMG, which historically have been audit firms. They audit the accounts of particularly public companies. But over the past few decades, they've branched into many other professional services. So we have consulting, we have what we call risk advisory services. So how to, for example, cybersecurity threats, how do you do that? We have IT services on that. We have tax services, legal services. And overall in the world, as I said, about 300,000 people. It's organized as a confederation of companies. So there's no head office. So PwC Nigeria is owned by the PwC Nigeria partners. And there's about 35 partners at PwC Nigeria. 34 of those are Nigerian. One is a foreigner, which is me.
Okay.
So it's locally controlled. But then what happens is we cooperate and work with the other member firms in making sure we have common systems and standards, but also work together on clients. So that's how the professional services firm, the Big Four, work. In Nigeria, we've been here since 1955. And we've got about 1,200 people right now working in Nigeria. We have 3 offices, one which is at Landmark Towers, which is Victoria Island, just on the waterfront where I used to work. And we have one in Abuja, and then we have one in Port Harcourt.
Awesome. So you moved to Nigeria 10 years ago for your current role at PwC, and you've stayed. So you've been in Nigeria for over 10 years. So what has kept you in Nigeria for 10 years?
Well, people, of course, Nigerians know how dynamic it is. But the way I describe it is sometimes people say it's because you love Nigeria, love Nigerians. I'm not sure that's true. It is true, but this is why I've stayed. So if you think a little bit about Western history or European history, and you kind of admire the European model, in countries like, I think, Sweden or Denmark, they have high standards of well-being. But, that took 1,600 years. So from the fall of the Roman Empire till the end of the Second World War was a very chaotic time in Europe. Many terrible things happened and progress was very slow. So if you wanted to witness history, no matter what era you lived in, you wouldn't witness very much. The thing that really keeps me in Nigeria is the sense of watching history unfold. Because even in the decade that I've come here, there have been so many changes. And we all know the challenges. We don't need to enumerate them. But I also see a lot of positive changes. And things are happening so quickly. So I get, as a person who's just spent a decade here, over a decade, get to witness the speed of change at this pace. And that's what's kind of amazing to me, to really be watching history unfold at this pace.
Awesome. So yeah, you've detailed in terms of the sense of watching history evolve. Things are happening so quickly. And I know I've seen on your profile, you've used a phrase that you're nation building in Nigeria, which mirrors what you've just said. So what has nation building in Nigeria involved during the 10 years you've been in the country?
Yeah, so my work at PwC, of course, I've got the normal kind of client work, often with governments, federal governments, or sometimes with the state governments to help them with their economic plans. I think it's quite publicly known. For example, we recently did a project with the SEC, so the securities regulator in Nigeria, to help them on their capital markets master plan. Capital markets are very important to the country, very important to me personally. So I've done my client work with that, work with AFDB, with different parts of the federal government. with a number of the states, including Lagos State. So that's my professional work. But where I really try to kind of have an impact on the nation is one through these NGOs I talked about, where I serve as either a trustee or advisory board, because these are people, His Royal Highness Muhammadu Sanusi II, who of course was the CBN governor and the Emir of Kano before now, is really trying to make extraordinary change here. So to be part of him trying to change the nation is a real privilege for me. I mentioned Imoukhuede's foundation that I'm on the advisory group to. But the other way is in our economics work at PwC. And as I said, wasn't really, even though I'm trained as an economist, didn't really use it professionally that much till I came to PwC. And most economists are just economists, so they don't embed it in the economy. But to be at PwC and to do some of what I talked about before, and kind of in the tech scene, really embeds me in the economy and makes it much, from my viewpoint, much easier to have kind of practical impact on the economy. But what we've tried to do at PwC is put out thought leadership that really sort of changes the narrative. So we wrote 7 or 8 years ago, I think, we started out by writing a paper on the cost of corruption. We presented to His Excellency the Vice President when he first came into office, had a big impact on his thinking. We wrote the paper on debt capital. I listened to the narratives about Nigeria and I find I don't agree with them. So then we write a paper. So people kept saying Nigeria is a poor country. I mean, that's absolutely false. And Nigeria is an incredibly rich country.
Yes.
An enormous number of assets, human assets, physical assets, agricultural assets. The problem is that a lot of these assets are dead assets in the sense they don't produce a return. So we wanted to make the point that that's really what's going on. So we wrote the paper on dead assets. We estimated the value of the dead assets. Most of it's in real estate, but some of it are government assets, for example, like the National Stadium, which are not really getting a return. Obviously, you've got Imoukhuede Steel, you've got the government-owned refineries. So these are assets that are not only giving no return, they're taking other resources from the country. So we wrote that paper and really put the concept of dead assets on the agenda. You hear the term dead assets used by the federal government. I've heard it, I think, used by some of the state governments. So that's what we try to do, is really put these ideas on the map. I got tired of hearing that Nigeria's biggest export is oil, because Nigeria's biggest export is people, is Nigerian brains. And unlike a lot of countries, so if you think of a country like the Philippines exports people. And they export some people high value added jobs, but they export a lot of maids to Saudi Arabia and Hong Kong, for example, or Indonesia, workers, construction workers around other parts of Asia. So not always the highest value added jobs. In Nigerians' case, the Nigerian diaspora, I mean, to put it in context, the average American Nigerian family earns more than the average American family, which is incredible for a new diaspora. So we're really exporting from here high value added brains. And we wrote the paper that said that the biggest export is not oil, it's Nigerian brains on that. And of course, it was picked up by NIDCOM. The chairwoman of NIDCOM and I are friends. She's doing a fantastic job really making everyone understand that. You now see states having their own diaspora commissions because they realize if they want to develop, they need to engage their diaspora and create credible ways for the diaspora to invest in the state, both with resources, but also with their time and energy and expertise. So that was something that we put on the agenda. No one was talking about it when we put out this paper, and it's still being talked about. We recently put out a paper on global value chains where we said, well, the diaspora is fantastic, it continues to grow. We have the Japa phenomenon. But it's not always ideal for people to leave the country. I mean, one, we could talk about brain drain for a while, but two, people don't necessarily want to have to be forced to go to Canada or go to the UK to carve out a career. They should be able to make a career here. So what we talked about was the fact that Nigerians can now insert themselves in global value chains without necessarily having to leave Nigeria. So we've always had, in the last 30 years or so, we've had this phenomenon of outsourcing and the growth of the IT industry in India in particular. I was in Bangalore a few weeks ago. There's 2 million IT workers there. But these are people earning very good wages, living in Bangalore. Bangalore is a fantastic city, not feeling the need to move to the United States. So we sort of said that's the model that kind of Nigeria needs to adopt. We can grow those sorts of industries without people necessarily having to leave the country. And now that's on the agenda. People are talking about it all the time. So that's how I really approach this sort of nation building, is try to put things on the agenda that get absorbed into the economic thinking, the policy making at the private sector. I have a lot of chances to give speeches and talk about these ideas on television with people who follow who know on television every week, talking about these ideas and how they apply to the economy and on Twitter, et cetera. And then more recently, 6 of us came out with a book. And the book arose because, a little bit like I've talked about on this podcast, everywhere I went outside of Nigeria, even sometimes within Nigeria, you'd hear this negative narrative about Nigeria. And for me, it was a bit jarring because I have these personal experiences. Every day I run into particularly young Nigerians trying to do extraordinary things, to do an NGO, do a startup, try to solve a big problem on that. So I have this cognitive dissonance where people are giving a negative narrative, particularly outside, and yet I see inside people just trying to do extraordinary things. And I think the people trying to do extraordinary things and all the others supporting them are going to win over time. That's why I'm optimistic. But we started thinking about a book about this. How could we tell this story? So we wrote a book, people telling their own stories about what they're doing to change Nigeria at their local level, even in some cases at a national level, just on their own impulse. And we called it self-organizing because the government is not organizing power. They're not organizing healthcare. They're not organizing education. They're not organizing security. They're not organizing infrastructure. So these are real challenges, and people have stepped up to try to solve these, sometimes as an individual, but oftentimes as a community, or as I said, even at a national level. So the 6 of us brought out this book called Self-Organizing Nigeria. And so people ask me why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because every day I see Nigerians trying to do extraordinary things under difficult circumstances. And as I said, I think the people trying to do these extraordinary things and the people supporting them are ultimately going to be the winners.
Thank you for that, Andrew. You detailed how, your work in nation building has involved work on the likes of AFDB, government, NGOs, and being embedded in the economy and understanding the true reality on the ground does build a sense of optimism. I think currently we are seeing a few challenges, not just in Nigeria, but globally. We're seeing a bit of an economic downturn, rising inflation, depleting foreign exchange, and devaluation of currencies. From your perspective, how has this potentially impacted the nation-building activities that you are carrying out in Nigeria in 2023?
Well, we're all aware of the economic challenges. And before I came to Nigeria, when I was still in the UK, I led PwC's global perspective on the financial crisis in 2008, which was fascinating, in fact, to see how that crisis had built up. Because I'd been in China before, not really following global economic matters, and came to the UK in 2008. The crisis happened. And all of a sudden, you had an entire meltdown of the economies and the financial system on that. And the reason I raise this is that when I'm speaking now, and you talk about the challenges of countries like the UK, the United States, Europe, in my view, these challenges that we're facing now arose because when we had the great financial crisis, the countries really refused to deal with them. So they had the incredible quantitative easing programs, zero interest rate policies for a long period of time, infinite supplies of money, big asset value bubbles in there. And the people who were the policymakers in 2010, 2012, 2014, it's a very natural human reaction to want to kind of kick the can down the road, right? You get to retire at some point. So why? So if you have the chance to kick the can down the road by keeping interest rates at zero, why not do that? And then you can go, retire to your ski chalet or whatever you're doing in France. But the problem with it was it built up pressures in the financial and economic system. And now we're finding them out with this rapid inflation, which no one's seen. I remember from 1979, 1980 in Canada, because I'm old enough that most people have never been through this. And it's created a lot of hardship. But that said, what I say in Nigeria is, look, Nigeria has so many attributes and so many things it can be doing independently of all of what's going on in the world out there. Just in strict economic terms, the economy should be growing a minimum of 6 to 8%. And it doesn't matter whether there's a war in Ukraine. It doesn't matter whether there's inflation in the United Kingdom. I don't allow those global events, at least in my thinking and when I talk about it, to absolve Nigeria of the challenge of being able to have inclusive growth in its own economy. Those, to me, just are excuses that are completely not valid. The issues and challenges that we face in Nigeria are self-inflicted. And, we all know that we don't need to reiterate them on the show. So even though there's global headwinds, it shouldn't affect what happens here. What it will affect, of course, is certainly many developed countries. And one in particular I'll cite, because you're in it right now, is the United Kingdom. And I've lived in the United Kingdom 3 times in my life before moving to Nigeria. And they face a raft of problems in the United Kingdom: the healthcare system, the education system, the transportation system, the social care system. Of course, they left the EU and they found out now their trading system is broke. They've had a big contraction in the economy. And again, it's the same thing. I mean, I think this is often in life, you neglect, not making it political, but you have 10 or 15 years where you're neglecting these problems and not addressing issues building up in these different parts of the society. And now they've all come home to be real issues in the United Kingdom. So I think they are really challenged by what's happened in the Ukraine, by the Brexit, by the aftermath of the great financial crisis. But I don't think Nigeria, given all the opportunities that we have here, should be using that as an excuse for not achieving a better economic outcome for the population.
Interesting. I do agree on that, Andrew. You detailed how a lot of the challenges that we are seeing globally are potentially impact or hangover from like the 2008 economic crisis, and also within Nigeria, a lot of the problems that Nigeria is facing could be described as self-inflicted. I've just come back from Nigeria and people are quite optimistic. They're looking forward to the future. But one of the main subjects of conversation is the coming election, which is next month. So I was wondering, from your perspective, what impact do you think the pending election could have or is having on Nigeria's economic outlook or growth in 2023 and going forward?
Well, I don't want to be overtly political. I'm not a citizen. I don't have the right to vote. Of course, if Nigerians move to Canada, they become citizens 3 or 4 years. In fact, one of my very dear friends just got elected. I think he's been in Canada 8 years.
Oh, wow.
And or less. He just got elected city councillor in Kitchener, which is about an hour outside of Toronto. So he's doing fantastic. As I said, so many amazing diasporans. So I don't have the right to vote here. Very difficult to get citizenship as a foreigner. But, I will say, without ascribing it to any political party, the last period of time has been really missed opportunities in the economy. And so many, as you said, there's so many self-inflicted issues. Of course, we have the foil subsidy, which is really, I think, many people have now correctly identified as essentially a scam. It has nothing to do, a corrupt form of corruption. It has nothing to do with sort of subsidizing the bottom of the pyramid. We have a similar thing going on with the FX regime. Electricity has not been sorted out. And then we have something else that has been going on that is just, I think, really challenging. People may be familiar with the PEBEX, or the Presidential Enabling Business Environment Committee, and they've done a fantastic job under Dr. Imoukhuede, working directly under His Excellency, the Vice President. We're trying to make a better business environment. And what you've seen is the politicians standing up at every event and talking about an enabling business environment. But the truth is, if we're honest with ourselves, the last number of years has not been enabled, despite all the rhetoric around it. It still remains very difficult. So the complexity here, the number of MDAs that you have to deal with, multiple taxation. So there's this myth going around, and the World Bank contributes to it, that Nigeria is a low tax country. Well, that's just not accurate. I can never keep track of them all. My wonderful colleague, Taiwo Oyedele, who is our tax leader, fiscal policy leader, is also always in the public eye, and he can list out, I think, the 50 different charges that come on doing business. So you have, and of course, you pay these charges, but then you don't get any services. So, for example, the electricity system, yes. Everywhere in the world you pay for electricity, but here you also pay for an entire other system, so that when there's no electricity, you're not out of business, right?
Very true.
Or in security, you pay your taxes, but you don't get security, so you have to hire. You're forced to hire private security. So in the end, it ends up being a very high tax, highly complex environment. The Orange report, which came out in 2013, was never got addressed until His Excellency President Buhari assented to it in 2020. But now we've come to 2023, and even though there was an agreement that it would be implemented, there's been no positive action. So we have all of these issues to face. So I think that if we consider that there are 3 credible people who might win the election, In some ways, all of them have said very quite similar things about addressing the issues. What are the issues, the economic issues? And I think the one overriding theme is, I think the foil subsidy is going to go away very quickly. It hasn't been budgeted in 2023 past June. It's just, by any measure, economic measure, it's just killing the country. And as I said, I think it's widely understood now, it's essentially a form of corruption. But I think the other thing that it seems that's common across the candidates is and something that I think is a great positive for the country. It's been a big change over the last decade, is the recognition that states can do their own economic and social development. So if I go back to like 2012, you didn't have state governors really thinking it was their responsibility to develop their states. But over the course of the last decade, you had all the governors have come to understand that. They all have investment promotion agencies. They have, as I said, diaspora commissions that they're coming out with. They've got economic plans. You have His Excellency Governor Obaseki in Edo State, doing incredible things. If you look at the economic plan they put together and the fact they've executed it, Ogun State's done very well. Kaduna State has probably the best economic plan, and they've faced extra challenges because of security. I think there are fewer and fewer governors that aren't trying to do the right thing for their state, and there's more and more recognition that the things that need to happen have to happen at the state level. If you think about health, you think about education, these are things that happen with the local population. And in other jurisdictions, they're not federal matters. So, for example, in Canada, education, health, social welfare are all provincial matters. The United States, the same thing. In India, they're all state matters as well on that. And I think we're getting that kind of devolution happening. And I think that's going to be a big change. I think that it was happening without the federal government necessarily saying it was happening. But I think all three of the major candidates who have credible chance to win the election really see that you need to drive this at the state level. Even electricity, I've been very public to say, for me, electricity should be state level matter. Why? Well, one, I'm biased as a Canadian. There's no national electricity. I don't think there's a national electricity regulator as far as I can tell. And you have a province, I was in Nova Scotia a couple of times last year, which only has 1 million people, perfectly fine at running its electrical system, its power system. But then you say, how shouldn't the power systems be connected? Well, sure, they should be connected. Ontario and Quebec are connected to New York, which is connected into the eastern seaboard system of the United States. But there's no oversight from one group about it. They just coordinate themselves to be able to wheel power, sell power, et cetera, on that. And that's where we should be. And of course, the other thing is technology has changed so much. You've got so much more small production of power, good economics, and solar, even in gas turbines, small gas turbines aren't that much more expensive per kilowatt hour than large gas turbines. So all of that says it should be kind of localized. And so I think all three candidates, when we have this change, they'll deal with the foil subsidy because they have to. I think the FX regime similarly is a system for abuse and round tripping that has to come to an end. And I think that they'll continue what has not been an explicit policy, but we've seen this kind of more states taking more responsibility. But I think they'll start to make the structural changes to make it clear what power the states have and what power remains in the federal government. So for those reasons, I'm optimistic. And really the state-led development over the past certainly 5 or 6 years has been something that's a big bright spot for Nigeria. And one interesting thing about it is, I may be wrong on this, but the World Bank is always World Bank to federal government. That's how they work. I think Nigeria was the first country about 7 or 8 years ago where they started working directly with the states because they recognized, even though they're very bureaucratic, I don't mean that in a negative sense, but a large institution, it doesn't move quickly, but they recognized that actually things were happening at the state level. You had to be at the state level. So a lot of their programs are designed for the state level, and that's really encouraging.
Thank you for that. You've raised some very interesting points regarding states taking more ownership of change, which I agree with 100%. You've also detailed in terms of what is driving the change at the state level, which gives me also a very good sense of optimism in terms of the way forward. But as you know yourself, when it comes to Nigeria, we're always optimistic and we're always talking about Nigeria's potential. But I think Nigeria, as you would probably admit yourself, hasn't realised its potential. So what do you think needs to be done so that the country does realise the massive potential that it does have?
Well, I think that one thing that's very important is not to make these complex plans that have been made before. So if you look at NDP, National Development Plan, is the one that recently came out. And if you look at it, sadly, it has things that are not going to happen on it. So, to create these plans that are not credible, I think is not helping the nation. What needs to happen, in both the self-organizing book and the paper on global value chains we did as PwC kind of come in the same way. The biggest asset the country has is people. We have very talented people. If we invest in these people, good things will happen. And I think there's a pattern here where we have physical investments and they're not panning out very well. So we have the electricity privatization. We have the Imoukhuede steel. There was a recent report. President Buhari was very seemingly proud of the fact that the country spent $100 million to resolve legal issues around Imoukhuede steel so they can move forward. Well, this plant was built in the late 1970s. I don't even know if there's even a plant left. So we poured millions more dollars into Imoukhuede steel and we have no steel. We poured billions of dollars into state-owned refineries. We have no refined product. The country, the banking system, and the federal government, through the way it operates the FX program, has poured, I think, $19 billion has been spent at the Dangote refinery. Yes. And there's no refined product. And people keep saying it's going to be next quarter. I sincerely hope it's coming after spending $19 billion. But there's a pattern here where, or for example, the terminal at MMA in Lagos, so there was $500 billion spent with a Chinese contractor to build that new terminal. And the big airlines are not moving over because, in their view, it's not designed properly for the big aircraft on that. So it's $500 million essentially, possibly wasted or more costs go in. We have the railroads. There was $4 billion, again, money sent to the Chinese, $4 billion of money which we borrowed to build the various railroads. And because of security and other issues, the railroads effectively are not operating. We're not getting a return. So there's a pattern here when we do these big physical infrastructure, big physical spends, we're not getting a return. On the other hand, when we invest in a Nigerian young person, we get a return, right? A big part of the JAPA movement is the fact that an educated Nigerian, someone who has a skill that the West needs because of demographic decline, can make a good living in the West and can send money back to the country. As I said, I'd like to see the system move where they can do the job while remaining in Nigeria. But if you want to have the right economic approach, what we argue in our global value chain paper is invest in young people to be able to insert themselves in global value chains. Don't invest in big physical infrastructure capital projects, which you don't know if there's going to be a return. But if I go back to Governor Obaseki for a moment, this is not just a plan because he's produced the graduates and they're doing it, but a target is to produce 35,000 young Nigerians that can essentially be software developers and work in the global ICT industry on that. So if he has 35,000 of those earning FX, it's transformative for the Edo economy, the Indian city economy on that. If you have every governor doing the same thing, they'll all be transformed because the people who have the jobs earning the FX are going to be buying using restaurants, food services, buying homes, buying their parents' homes, et cetera. So, it all comes back to investing in people. You take our healthcare system. I don't think it matters one bit whether we build physically another hospital, physically these primary healthcare centers, PHCs that are so critical. What really matters is, do we have the human capital that can do it? And obviously we're losing some healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses and others in the JAPA phenomenon. So what that means is not trying to stop them from going because they end up sending a lot of money and bringing skills back. Even the hospital the vice president got treated in a few months ago was paid for and opened by the diaspora community. But what we need to do is invest in many more young people to make sure they're getting their skills. So the biggest tragedy of one of the biggest tragedies of 2022 for me was the strike at ASU. So you have the loss of essentially a full year of education. The economic and human cost of that is just absolutely staggering. And that's why something like the foil subsidy makes me so angry because the cost of solving the full demands of ASU were, I think, something like less than a quarter of the foil subsidy for the year. So you just shake your head. Why would you invest in what is essentially a corrupt system, some minor benefit to rich people who use the most foil, instead of investing in your young people who need their education now. And losing a year of your education is an extraordinary economic cost, much more than the 2 trillion naira that the ASA was asking to solve its demands.
Thank you for that, Andrew. So you've detailed something quite important, something that I definitely agree with, which is that investing in people is the way forward for Nigeria to realize its potential. And I guess that leads into the work that you're doing at Self-Organizing Nigeria, which is a project that you've kind of embarked on to answer an important question, which is, despite the multitude of challenges that Nigeria faces, why is Nigeria not a failed state? So, from your research you've carried out, why is Nigeria not a failed state?
Well, because there are people that just organize around the fact that the public sector does not do what is required of the public sector. So it doesn't deliver healthcare, it doesn't deliver education, it doesn't deliver infrastructure, it doesn't deliver security, which maybe comes first on that, it doesn't produce a credible energy system. So people sort of scratch their heads and say, well, if those things aren't coming from the public sector and I can't rely on the public sector, I'm going to have to figure out myself how to do it. And of course, then people come together and say, well, you don't necessarily want to have an energy system by yourself. You might want to have a mini grid for a community or a security system that the local community designs. Education in Lagos, for example, 85% of students, if I understand correctly, go to private education because essentially they can't rely on the public system. So all of these mechanisms have sprung up to compensate for the fact that Nigeria doesn't get these public services. And what we argue in the book is it's created a phenomenon which we use the term from Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, but he wrote another, which I think even better book, which isn't as widely known, which is called Anti-Fragility. And what he studies in that book are systems that get stronger under stress. I mean, we all know the challenges ordinary Nigerians face up and down, many challenges daily. So I don't want to make it necessarily sound like a good thing, but the fact there have been so many challenges have made Nigerians into the anti-fragile people and who find ways to create these systems. But what's interesting, what we really stress in the book is we weren't so interested in systems or compensations that just serve the individual, your own self-interest. We all understand that mechanism. What we were really interested in the book is people that took on these system challenges, tried to solve the problem for everyone. So let me give you an example. So there's a young man, young Nigerian, well, he's not so young by my standards. His name is Hakeem Subair. And he started a school because he couldn't find a very good primary school or nursery school for his young family. So he started a school. And it was very successful. He grew the school for a little while. I think it was in Ibadan. But he couldn't scale it fast enough to, everyone was coming to him. They wanted an education at his school, et cetera. So then he started to ask himself the following question: how can I actually affect the whole education system? So you think the whole education system. I mean, this is one guy. In other countries, the Ministry of Education is supposed to think about how to affect the whole education system. But here's one guy who's got the courage to take this on. So what did he do? He eventually figured out, based on his experience, because he was in education, that the only model that worked was something that affected the quality of the teachers, quality of the teaching. Like you couldn't create a system that went directly to the students, because what really matters to the students is the teachers they interact with and the way the teachers teach and work with their students. So then he said, okay, I'm going to design something that impacts and of course it has to be virtual because you wouldn't have the resources to create a physical structure for this. So he created something called 1 Million Teachers, which is this program that basically upskills the teachers and gives them rewards as they move through certain levels and feedback, and in some cases some monetary help for what they're trying to do on that. And this is an NGO. He eventually got some help from Canadians, just coincidentally. So he's based at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, taking on this massive problem. And now other NGOs, people with money, real resources, people like the Gates Foundation, Hewlett Packard have come along and said, wow, here's someone who's figured out with his team and others that have joined him how to take on this problem. And that's the stories we really like to tell, are people who see a problem and take it on in a way, just the kind of sheer courage of that. I mean, it's a little bit similar to where I mentioned a little bit earlier, Madame Obi, Ezekiel Willie's program was. So what happened was, people who are very familiar with Nigeria would know that she's very famous, was Minister of Education, Minister of Mines, worked at the World Bank, very well respected Nigerian. She ran for presidency in 2019. It was not really a very successful situation because the candidates outside of the mainstream parties had talked about somehow cooperating to put up more of a fight. Kingsley Imoukhuede, who was, of course, the central bank deputy governor, was another one of them. They never seemed to get coordinated, and it was a bit of a disappointing experience, I think, for people outside of the two main parties. Anyway, so she went away to have a think about how could she have an impact on governance, because she came to the conclusion that her running herself for public office isn't going to make a difference. How do you take on the whole governance issue? One person being elected, trying to do the right thing, isn't going to move the system. So then she was in Germany. I went to visit her, and she was in Berlin, had a fellowship to think about these things. So she came up with a system and says, well, why don't we train thousands of young people who want to become politically active and actually run as politicians? And we're going to teach them economics. We're going to teach them political theory. We're going to teach them governance. We're going to teach them ethics, how to be an ethical politician. And over time, this will grow as these people are more and more active in politics and at the local LGA level and then state level, national level. And that's what she's done and created this organization on that. No one asked her to do it. No one gave her the idea to do it. She figured it out on her own. And it's been fabulously successful. And of course, a whole lot of people, including myself, came along to help Madame Obi because there were no resources. So the faculty members are not paid. We're all volunteers. I've done a couple of sessions each of the cohorts, and it's amazing. You've got 180 people in the class. They're divided into groups. My sessions are always highly interactive, so I'm not listening to me lecture for 3 hours. And these are absolutely brilliant Nigerians who want to do the right thing for the country. They come from every state. On there. They're in teams with people from different parts of the country. We're now we're into the fourth cohort of this. So 200 people, no, more than 200 per cohort. So we're getting close to 1,000 people with the 4 cohorts that we put together. And that starts to have an impact, as I said, but no one asked Madame Obi to do it. She just saw a big problem and said, I'm going to take it on. I'm similar, I mentioned a little before, I'm on the advisory board of the Imoukhuede Foundation. So Imoukhuede, for those who don't know, of course, is the founder of Access Bank, so the largest bank in Nigeria. He doesn't have any need to, he's obviously a wealthy man, very successful. He's moved on from banking and has the coronation companies and is in investment banking and insurance, et cetera. But his foundation takes, again, this problem of governance, and he puts his own resources and time into it and brought together others to support him to try to solve the governance issue. And in his case, a few things they do. They send a number of the federal civil servants to Oxford, to the Blavatnik School of Government. Foundation's totally paying for this. The federal government cannot afford to send people to Oxford. It has another program in Abuja, national, but based in Abuja, where it brings faculty members from Blavatnik, and it takes 50 high-performing younger civil servants through a program, again, looking at economics and politics and policy, governance and ethics to make them better as civil servants. And he just stepped up to do this with the other people that are helping him. But then on a smaller scale, so I support an NGO, a small charity called Yagazi Foundation. And this is, again, young Nigerian just trying to solve a problem. So he was concerned about deprivation in underserved communities and communities that are really challenged, like Makoto in Lagos. His work is largely in Lagos on that. And they work largely through football. So they have football days where they bring coaches and uniforms and food to these communities and have a couple of hundred young children going through that and participating in that. No one asked him to do this. He just stepped up. And of course, it's not easy to get the resources to do it. So he's constantly looking to raise funds and get other in-kind things. As I said before, I think this group of people are ultimately going to be the ones that win in this country and take Nigeria to a better place.
Thank you for that, Andrew. So you mentioned how the self-organizing phenomenon in Nigeria, sadly, it is out of necessity, but it is also connected to the work that you've done to reframe the perception that Nigeria's biggest exports is not petroleum or commodities, but the brain power within the nation and also in the diaspora. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in terms of Nigerian brain export report that you released recently?
Right. So, you go back to what I said a little earlier in the podcast around the difficulties we've had with physical capital. And a lot of investors have had a bad experience. Both domestic investors and international investors have had some bad experiences. And so it's really unrealistic to expect we're going to be growing the highly capital intensive industries on that way. And if you think, take manufacturing. So I think there's always this belief you need manufacturing. So imagine we were going to manufacture table fans. So this would count as low end manufacturing. So this is like the Korean model. Let's start at low end manufacturing, and then over time we'll go into higher value added. And now, of course, Korea makes chips. But here's the problem: if you want to set up a manufacturing plant, and I want to produce one table fan, I need the entire input supply chain, some of which is going to have to come from outside. So go through the customs and port system, which is completely, expensive and complex. I'm going to have to set up the entire factory just to make one fan. I'm going to have to set up the entire factory to make a single fan. I'm going to have a sales distribution system. Where am I selling the fans to? On there, presumably, manufacturing for export. So I need a system to be able to export them. So you think of the complexity of setting up manufacturing. Now you think of the services. And I think sometimes people either forget or don't know, in terms of GDP globally, 2/3 of GDP is services. Right? Because people use more services than they do physical goods now, right? I mean, that's been a transition. So people tend to think of export as having to be physical goods. But in fact, India exports over $200 billion worth of US dollars worth of services. Now, but the thing that really makes services work well for a country like Nigeria is you take something like software development. So now it was happening, but really accelerated by COVID, this phenomenon where you have a distributed team. So you could have, let's say you had a team of 20 people working on a programming job. You could have one Nigerian. Ukraine was a big source of this. 3 Ukrainians, more challenging now. 2 people from Poland, 5 from Costa Rica, mixed together on that. And you don't have to set up a big infrastructure, all or nothing infrastructure. So let's say a company comes along and says, "Okay, I've heard that Nigerians are really smart. We'll do a little bit of training and we'll hire some of them as developers and see how they do," right? So they come along and they try it out and they hire 5 developers, right? Not a big risk for them. They're willing to try it. And those developers do well. So they, wow, this is a really good place for us. We can get very talented people, work very hard, good, much less than Silicon Valley or London. So the next project we do, instead of having 5 out of 100 developers from Nigeria, we're going to have 20 out of Nigeria. And you can see it's much more modular that way. And it's also modular in the sense that the individual is taking their own responsibility. I mean, the table fan system is not setting up itself, right? But when you have a young Nigerian who can do something in the global value chain, so whether in business process outsourcing or in accounting, for example, legal services, software development, animation, they also organize themselves, right? It doesn't take much to spark. And I've been amazed as I've investigated this, finding people who found their own roles in global value chains. No one helped them. So because I'm tuned into this, I reach out to people. I had someone connect to me on LinkedIn. I always connect on LinkedIn with young Nigerians. And this was an individual who was based in Kano. And he listed on his LinkedIn profile that he was doing IT work with a Canadian telecoms company. And I said, wow, how does that happen? So I actually reached out to him on LinkedIn, set up a meeting with him because I wanted to understand the story. So the Canadian company, of course, were facing, because of these demographic changes, real shortage of skills in many sectors, including programming, or in this case, AI, artificial intelligence, which is a new skill. And so this company was willing to try it. And he had the skills and he started doing remote working for them. So he's getting paid in dollars. And buying a house for his parents, and no one helped him. I mean, the government didn't get involved in this. In fact, the whole diaspora phenomenon is another example of self-organizing. No one gets involved in that. The diasporans organize it on their own. But the thing is, the story, because of the young man's abilities and drive to figure it out, got himself inserted in the global value chain. So what we argue in the paper is, look, that's a much better. So if we had taken the $20 or $19 billion I had mentioned about on the Dangote refinery. And we had invested, by our estimates, $10,000 to $15,000 to take a college graduate or even a high school graduate who has the capability to do programming, to turn them into a programmer who can work in a global project. Takes at most $10,000 to $15,000. We think a lot less. But if you think about it, if we had taken that let's call it $10,000. So if we had taken that $19 billion that's now in a refinery that's producing no refined product, and we instead had upskilled the Nigerians, I think that's 1.9 million Nigerians that would now be working remote value chains. And now you can say, hang on, how do we get 1.9 million people working remote value chains? Well, there's 28 million just in software development. I'm not talking about call center, BPO, or legal profession. Just in software development, there's 28 million people globally who are software developers. In 10 years, we need 42 million on them. And we're the country that's got the continent, but particularly Nigeria, have the young people to do that. So that's where we should be focused on in terms of building value. But the other reason for, quite frankly, is people earn more. So I've had some pushback being not keen on manufacturing, not that I'm opposed to it, but in terms of policy. And I say to people, look, the woman or man working in Foxconn factory in southern China is probably earning, I don't know these days, $700 a month. The software developer who assembling the Apple iPhone, the software developer who works in Silicon Valley for Apple on this is earning $150,000 a year. Well, and Nigerians are perfectly talented enough to be the software developer. As I said, it's easier, it's more modular, it's happening already. Why wouldn't you put your focus on making sure that the policies and the education system supported people working in these global value chains where they have high incomes? And if we had, we put in the paper, we would target 2 million people in this industry within about 10 years. And so not just software development, but call center, BPO, animation, all of those things combined. We have a number for each one, about 2 million. We're transformative on that. And it's perfectly feasible. Partially it's feasible because people self-organize. So if you give them the opportunity, you don't have to do much because they're going to do all the rest of the work. They're already doing it with no support. So there's a little bit of support, a little bit of bandwidth, a little bit more of the government being able to steer young people to where there's a real opportunity on that. But it's starting to emerge, so I'm optimistic. But that's a lot of the basis of self-organizing. The other thing about self-organizing is, coming from Canada, again, we have this expectation when you come to Canada, and it's worked well for us, but the government is going to take care of things. And one of the consequences of that is this little bit of a lack of energy. If you expect the government to take care of your education, you expect the government to take care of your healthcare. I think Nigerians going to Canada sometimes have the sense of a very lethargic place. And I think there's some truth in it. So the other thing we wanted to do with self-organizing was say, look, this is a very powerful, and maybe there's something the world can learn about it. So I've tried to get, the authors of the self-organizing book have tried to get the concept picked up in more global forums and discussed, because I think there's a long-term consequence to the way, say, we do things in Canada, which works well, but it creates this lethargy, as I said. So I think we need to bring the kind of energy that the Nigerians have and showcase the self-organizing principle on a global scale.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Andrew. You've mentioned a lot of this brain power export seems to be self-organized. What can be done at, say, state or federal level to strategically organize this brain power export out of Nigeria to move the country forward?
Right. So I think what should happen, and again, I think Edo State's in the lead on this, is the state governor and his team should be talking to both the local companies and the global companies, like the obvious ones like Google, to help them design a program that can upskill their youth to insert themselves in global value chains. So that there's a curriculum that works, program that works. I'm aware of one private company here actually has a very good one that it started to develop software programmers from Germany or licensed. But the state governor said to Google, look, help us we'll start out small, put through 100 people, say university graduates in 9 to 12 months can be ready to work on these sorts of projects. You commit to hiring a certain number of them so that we have some baseline of jobs. And then that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is, what do you need to do this training, to do this work, you need bandwidth and you need power. So simultaneously with the training aspect and with reaching out to who are eventually the global employers, you also need to make sure that you are producing the power. Now, the power is not a lot. You're not producing power for large-scale industrialization. It's to make sure you can run a computer and make sure you can run the telecoms network. So this is where solar is really critical because it's a resilient system that can produce, enough power for what we need here. And then the third thing I think you should do as a state governor is make sure that you're good relationship with the telecoms firms and you understand, the relationship between like the big MTN, Glow, Airtel type players, but also the ISPs, the specialized ISPs, how they fit together and how to make sure you have enough bandwidth. I mean, if you take Lagos as an example, people may be familiar with Yaba Tech. So Yaba was a specific initiative, it was more than a decade ago now, to make sure that you could create an IT hub that's been fantastically successful. One part of it is simply having bandwidth. And if you're going to have someone programming for Apple or programming for Google, they've got to be able to be connected to all the systems that allow this to happen. So those are some things that, as I said, again, I'm thinking at a state level, the governor and his team. I say his team because there's no women governors. I hope that changes soon, but the governor should focus on. But these aren't complex things. This isn't like building the Dangote refinery. It's not like building the second Niger bridge. It's not like building rebuilding Ajaokuta Steel from a 40-year-old plant, right? I mean, what I've just described are modular small steps that I think, lots of states have governors that would be able to do that. So.
I guess connected to this, you've previously discussed the demographic revolution in terms of Africa's young and growing working age population, as well as the aging population in most Western countries. How can African countries capitalize on this new dynamic?
I mean, there's only one thing that needs to be done is everything has to be organized around investing in upskilling young people. So the opportunities are out there for work. The other countries need people to do the work. Some cases the work is physical. Some cases the work can be done virtually. They need Africans. I mean, I don't know if people saw the headline, China's population is starting to shrink. There were only 9.56 million babies born in China last year.
Oh, wow.
There were 44 million babies born in Africa on that. So what that means is in 20 years from now, there's only going to be 9.56 million or a little less, because sadly a few will have died, the Chinese, and over 44 million Africans born. So there'll be 44 million 20-year-old Africans, and they're the ones going to be doing the world's work. So the only thing that should be in the minds of the policymakers is, how do I get them prepared to be able to do the work? And the world knows it needs them. So I had the privilege of going to the World Cup. So I'm a big football, I still play football. Sadly, I come from a nation that hasn't been very often. I'm Canadian. So I remember we had the World Cup. It was in Mexico in 1986. We got there because it was an extra spot in CONCACAF because of Canada, because Mexico as a host nation got a bye. So we went and we didn't score a goal, and we haven't been back since. So I was very excited that Canada made it. And so I was in Qatar, and I hadn't been in Qatar for 7 or 8 years maybe. And it was really striking to me how every job was now being filled by Africans, because Qatar needs people. I mean, the number of young people outside of Africa is going down. It's already going down. It's not increasing. Number of children outside of Africa is already going down. So we need Africans to play these roles. If you think of how rapidly Europe is aging, and you think of, whether it's high-end skilled workers like we've been talking about, or caregivers, well, they're still highly skilled, doctors, nurses. They're going to need Africans. They're going to need Nigerians. So the thing that needs to be on the policymakers' head is, how do we prepare them? And as I said, compared to trying to build out physical infrastructure like these refineries and the second Niger bridge, the amounts are relatively modest on it. So it's not like it takes huge resources to do the upskilling. So if we just invested all our effort in creating talented young Africans who can, since take care of themselves, they'll take care of the whole continent in terms of kind of economically. So that's what I would say about that. I went to, on the same trip, on the way back from our trip to Asia, we went to Oman. Again, Oman, I'm sure not many people have been there, but it's really a lovely country. And I hadn't been there again for about 7 or 8 years. Again, struck everywhere you turn, young Africans are the ones doing the work. So it's obvious how the demographic revolution is happening to people who watch this closely. And we just need to take advantage of it in Africa. But it just highlights the biggest tragedy. Again, go back to the ASUS strike. How is it possible in Africa's biggest country to end up in a situation where university students and federal universities lose entire school year? It's just a complete tragedy. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we can't allow to happen.
Thank you for that, Andrew. So you detailed that Africa's population is growing, and that is a trend that is likely to continue for many more years. So thinking in terms of the theme, in terms of trends, what are some of the positive trends that you're seeing from your work with regards to, say, African economy, policies, trends that you're currently optimistic about and we should watch out for?
I mean, all the issues that we're talking about today are now really well understood in Nigeria, certainly on that. But I think something else that's really critical is, and go back to why I'm so positive on the diaspora, what's countering the negative image of Nigeria, perhaps Africa with others, is when they have a positive experience with a Nigerian in their workplace, in their community on that. And now Nigerians are everywhere. So I've really noticed a difference, say, over the last decade. If 10 years ago, if I went to Canada and I said I worked in Nigeria, people would have a very negative image. But that's actually changing, because now everyone I bump into, Canadians who've grown up there, work with Nigerians.
Yes.
So then they say, wow, okay, you're Nigerian. We've got two guys, a woman and a guy at our company. They came to Canada 3 years ago. They're really, really smart, really talented. I mean, that's really been, I think, one big change that's very positive for Africa. So the more we get Africans working with, whether it's remotely or in person, working with people around the world in different countries, the more positive image that we're going to project for Africa, and then create even more opportunities for the people in Africa to be inserted in these global value chains or go to countries to work if needed faster and faster.
I agree. So I guess looking forward, where do you see Nigeria's future economically, socially, culturally, politically? I know this is a very broad and wide question. Where do you see the country in the next 5 years' time?
Well, I think that I don't make predictions generally about the future, but what I'm going to say is it isn't going to take much to head in the right direction here. I mean, as I said, we all know the negatives. We haven't well taught it in this podcast because we don't need to. We all know that. But you just have the sense that because the issues are so well understood and because of the energy level of Nigerians in and outside of Nigeria, there's this readiness to take advantage of when there's some and because of this self-organizing, which means the government doesn't have to do much. I mean, I once stood up on television and said, Nigeria should be the easiest country to govern because it's self-organizing and people just get on with things. More is less. I mean, the big problem in one way for the federal government is they're trying to do too many things, too many programs, too much complexity. They just stop doing things. So I think that if we have some policymakers and politicians that recognize that, who try to do less, who really invest in people, and then those people will figure out at their local community how to build a healthcare network, how to build an education system, we can really accelerate quickly. And if we have a few states that show that what can be done at a state level, and then what happens is that state is a example for the states in that region. So then, of course, people in the other states say, well, wait a minute, if we elect, we need to elect the right governor who's going to make sure that we're also going in that direction. So I think in 4 or 5 years, we could be in a much better place. But this depends on a few things. One is, I'm not going to predict who's going to win the election. We know that some of the candidates may have, health issues, health challenges that make it difficult to fulfill the duties, which is a real concern. I mean, but, assuming we end up with a good administration, doing a few of the right things, I think things could turn fast very quickly. But we need to obviously have an orderly transition of power. And one of the other things which I haven't discussed, and I don't discuss the solution because I'm not an expert, but certainly from an economic viewpoint, the biggest issue in Nigeria for the economy and social development is insecurity. And I'm not the only one saying that. Everyone is saying that. So it's really important that the next administration gets its arms around the insecurity issues and help solve them in a meaningful way. But of course, a big part of insecurity is the economic conditions. I mean, when we have kidnapping as a profit-making enterprise. I mean, one of the reasons that's arisen is because there aren't other avenues for young people to be able to make a meaningful way. So I sincerely hope the next administration comes into power peacefully. They really get on top of the insecurity issue, and then they invest all the resources they can in young Nigerians' health and education, social programs. And then the young Nigerians will take care of the issues themselves. They'll figure out how to build infrastructure. They'll figure out how to export. They'll figure out how to insert themselves in global value chains and be part of the diaspora if that's it. But that will be the path for social development in Nigeria.
Fantastic. Thank you. So looking closer to home, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Will you still be living in Nigeria?
I mean, PwC, so the big four, as I mentioned, they have, I think they're all in the same situation where partners are retired at 60. And the reason for that is to make sure that younger people can have opportunities. So, I've done my part with PwC. Our year end is June 30th. So on June 30th, 2023, when I'm 60, I'll be retiring from PwC in Nigeria, at least as a partner. What are my plans? I'm just putting them together. I do need to be a bit closer to my kids. I mean, they're getting on and they're in their 30s now. And one's been married, and I just have been away a long time. So I need to be a bit closer to the kids. But in terms of connectivity with Nigeria and Africa, my plan is to continue with some of the NGO work, and then go on 2, 3, 4 boards of companies who are doing kind of amazing things here. So I'll certainly kind of not stop coming to Nigeria. But in terms of a base, it'll either be the United Kingdom. My wife is British, or probably the United States. I'm not sure I would go back to Canada, to be honest, after living abroad for 25 years and mainly in warmer countries, over 20 of those years in warmer countries. I cannot live with the Canadian winter. So
no problem. It's safe to say that no matter what happens in the next 5 years' time, you'll still have a close connection or affiliation with Africa or Nigeria.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. So as I said, I'm going on the boards. That's a 5 or 7 year commitment. And as I say to people, I want to live long enough to see how this all turns out.
Awesome. From the work you've done and what you see on the ground, it's definitely moving in the right direction. Sometimes quicker or sometimes slower than hoped.
I described a little earlier in the podcast, it took 1,600 years from the fall of Rome to the end of the Second World War in Europe. And, what happened over 1,600 years is happening in a few years in Nigeria. So, could the fuel oil subsidy have been taken off 2 or 3 years ago? Yeah, it could have. But, 2023, this issue will get solved. Could the relationship between the federal government and the state level being dealt with 5 years ago? So, yeah, it could have. But 5 years? I mean, the Earth is 4 billion years old. 5 years here and there isn't a lot. I mean, we want it to progress because we want to alleviate suffering of Nigerians. But from a historical viewpoint, Nigeria is moving very fast. I just want to live long enough to, as I said, kind of witness history.
Brilliant. I'm sure you'll definitely see it.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Well, I think, I'm not sure it's a proverb, but I do. It has helped me over the years just to keep this, the Earth's 4 billion years old perspective. I mean, it's so easy to get kind of involved in your day-to-day problems, but I've really found over my life to be able to kind of take that perspective on it. And maybe the proverb is, this too shall pass. I mean, we're all confronted in our daily life with challenging situations. The one thing I've learned, having done this so long, is everything passes. I mean, you deal with it the best you can. You take responsibility. You try to make the most positive impact. But whatever the challenges are today, they will pass. But the one piece of advice I'll give actually to this group. So sorry, I need to have a few more minutes. I'm going to do one other group that is just amazing. So there's a Nigerian in Lagos, Lawrence Mba, and he has this Waka community. And on Twitter, actually, most of what I'm doing on Twitter is about Waka community. And this is a very simple concept. I mean, the biggest determinant of the quality of your life, your mental health, your sleep, is actually physical activity.
Yes.
And in fact, there's more and more economic evidence that the reason our economy, say the British economy, is doing so bad is because people are so unhealthy. So instead of having Theresa May cut taxes for people that want to be billionaires, if you actually had more focus on better eating, getting children to be active, that's what will make a difference to mainstream economic numbers like productivity. But anyway, Lorenz has started this walking community, and it's fantastic. No one asked him to do this. I post Twitter on it every day because it's probably the biggest impact I'm ever going to have in the country is getting people to be active physically in the lifestyle changes it makes on that. And so I'll just leave people with just the thought that every day you need to be physically active. And if all of us were more physically active every day, your mental health would be better, your productivity would be better, your relationships would be better, you would be happier. And we'd have a much better nation. So I think that, and particularly in this nation, and especially among people that are better off, the health habits are not good. You hear about all the premature deaths from diabetes, from cardiac arrest, et cetera. So I just think what Loren's doing, he's a national hero to me, and another great example of self-organizing Nigeria.
Thank you for sharing that. I think I'll be renewing my gym membership straight after our conversation. I think I could definitely do it for a bit more of a healthier day-to-day routine or activity. So thank you for sharing that.
You're very welcome.
So as we're coming to the end of the conversation, do you have any closing remarks, any final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you do or who are just interested in the Nigerian economy in general?
Well, I think for those who are outside of Africa and outside of Nigeria, I think you need to recognize that this is Africa's time. Really, Africa, I gave the demographic numbers. I remember, I went to China the first time in 1983, so I was part of the incredible economic transformation of China. My wife is of Indian origin, so very familiar with the economic and social transformation in India. But what's happening in Africa is just as dramatic and on a bigger scale. So everyone in the world should be taking an interest. If they're interested in how the world is going to evolve, a big part of that is, the major part of that is going to be determined by what happens in Africa. So in that sense, and of course, all people came from Africa. So we're all Africans.
What a fantastic way to finish or close today's conversation. Thank you for your time, Andrew. It's been an extremely insightful discussion. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And thank you for giving us your time today, because I know you're extremely busy. So once again, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Trisha. I really enjoyed it.
Enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to speaking soon in the near future.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.